Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Today we learn about the crucial role of coastal wetlands and salt marshes in the absorption of CO2 and the threats that climate change brings to those ecosystems. Our guest is Robinson Fulweiler, Professor of Earth, Environment, and Biology at Boston University. Dr. Fulweiler is an expert on wetlands and marshes and the impact of climate change on these ecosystems. She'll also describe a current project that includes citizen scientists, so stay tuned. Dr. Fulweiler, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'd like to ask, first of all, for a distinction, if there is one, between a salt marsh and wetlands. Are they different? Or?
Yes, so we could spend, hours talking about this. So it's totally understandable that there can be confusion.
Yes.
So wetland is really like an encompassing term, like an umbrella. And then underneath that are lots of different types of ecosystems. So a wetland simply is any ecosystem that has lots of water on it, as you could imagine in wetlands, right? Like saturated soils or inundated water all the time, like around a lake or a pond or something like that. Or it could be something close to the coast, something that is more sort of tidally influenced. And so the EPA generally recognizes two broad categories of wetland. There's inland waters, non-tidal inland waters, and then there's sort of tidal coastal waters.
Okay, all right. So,
yes.
All right, and then marsh?
Yes, so then we can go really deep if we want to. But so then marshes really are dealing primarily with the type of vegetation that's there.
Okay.
If you think about, you could have something like a swamp, which might be more like woody, tree-like organisms. Right. And then in a marsh, you're talking about more like soft stems. So more grasses tend to dominate.
Yes.
You can also have small shrubs and herbaceous species and things like that too.
Okay, so you're doing some work now, I think, on the salt marshes in particular. And I think of that with salt water.
Absolutely,
right?
That's right.
Wetland could be either one, is that right?
Exactly,
Fresh water
so think of it goes like wetland, and then you could go down between like freshwater and saltwater.
Okay. And these marshes, I think, are supposed to be really important. And so if you could tell us something about that, why they might be important, and they're fading quickly in some areas, right?
Yes.
So we'll go into that a bit too. But can you tell us about the salt marshes, first of all, like what's in there, and it's an ecosystem, I think.
Sure. So salt marshes are these magical places, and I don't know if you have been to one, but you should go if you have not.
Definitely.
Okay, all right.
This is Massachusetts.
That's right. That's right. So they're like I said, they're predominantly grasses, right? But they're homes to a whole bunch of different organisms, and so some of them are there permanently, like these grasses or marsh birds and things like that. Some of them are migrating, so they're really important for like flyover stops for a whole bunch of different birds. A lot of terrestrial or land animals like to come and feed there, like raccoons or deer.
Yes.
Right. When the marsh floods during a high tide, you can get fish coming from the estuary right onto the marsh to feed. So they are these really important ecosystems for a whole bunch of different organisms. But it's not just habitat they provide. They also provide lots of different things that we call ecosystem services, which is kind of a term that is sort of fraught. But the idea is if we had to pay for something, it would cost us a lot of money, right? But a lot of natural systems provide them just by being there.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
So salt marshes provide this in the terms of habitat for organisms we're interested in, like we like to watch birds or something, or we like to eat fish. They provide the nursery ground for lots of them.
Too?
Shellfish, crabs, all of those things. But they also do things like help stop storm surge.
Yes.
Which is really important. They help protect coasts from eroding. Sounds important, right? It is.
Right.
And then they can also sequester carbon.
Okay.
And that's also important.
Before that, let me just check here. I think there are the plants and animal kind of configuration is very important also, and I think maybe some of these, I guess they're called grasses, mainly in these salt marshes, they're very important, but they are threatened also. Is that true?
Sure.
true,
So
they all are
yeah. So they're all independent, right? So I think if you think of a salt marsh where it is, right, it's like a ribbon along coasts.
Yeah.
And so they're really forming these boundaries between land and sea, and they're made to do that. They're adapted to do that, right? So for the plants, for example, are adapted to be there, and they have all really interesting adaptations. If you want to talk about any of those,
right.
Okay. So they know how to grow essentially when their soils are super wet and they get flooded routinely. They know how to deal with some amounts of storms and those kinds of things. But when we begin to stress them too much, we move them out of that like zone that they're adapted to, and basically we overstress them.
Yes, and there might be a question of how quickly they might adapt.
Absolutely.
Might be if they're able to adapt. I think this has come up with shellfish, the contamination issue, the everything issue, but it just in general, both the plants and the creatures that inhabit these are sort of vulnerable if they have to adapt quickly. Can you give us an example of like one or two good adaptations, what you mean?
Yeah, sure. So if you think of salt like one of those grasses, like a Spartina species, which is really common, right? So this grass is living there, and it knows its nose.
It knows.
I do think of things like that. So I know that's not scientific, but that is how I think about things. So pardon that.
We're sympathetic.
Okay, so if you think of this plant growing, what does it have to deal with? Well, if it's going to get flooded, it might have to deal with the fact that water is not going to let as much light go through, so it's not going to be able to photosynthesize as quickly. So what can it do there? Well, some plants have been adapted to grow stems like super quickly. What else? When it's covered with water, it means that there's not going to be as much oxygen available to the roots of the plant. And one thing that I think we often forget is that plants respire just like us.
Yes.
So we think of them photosynthesizing and producing oxygen,
Yeah.
which they do, yes, and they have to breathe. So if your roots are constantly covered with water, then you don't have access to oxygen as quickly. So they've adapted these neat things like special roots for figuring out how to breathe better. They have some plants, like different types of trees, and some mangrove species have something called pneumatophores, which are like breathing roots that stick up out of the ground like straws.
Yes.
Some of them have prop roots, which can literally like lift them out of the soil a little bit. What else fun things do they have? They have a mechanism to actually pump oxygen from their leaves down into their roots. It's called oxygenating the rhizosphere, which is really
That is
cool.
really neat.
Yep, and then sometimes they have to get rid of other gases or deal with things. So they have something called parenchyma, which are basically these like holes in their stems. So it turns out that plants can actually transmit gases in both directions quite efficiently, and that's like a whole new area of research that's
What a
opening up.
thing. Yes.
Plants are quite smart.
They really-
I mean, I
yeah,
can't
that's
say that
right,
they're
right,
smart.
right.
I know, but they're quite
Somebody
smart.
recently said, if plants are so smart, should we be eating them?
Don't go down that. That's,
and you may be sympathetic.
Yeah. You read like Omnivore's Dilemma, and you're like, I won't eat anything. Yes.
In terms of the other kinds of creatures, are they, in your mind, very specially adapted also? I see immediately the vulnerability of these plants if you have rapid change. But
Yeah, the animals are too, and they have a bunch of different adaptations. Different shellfish, for example, can do very well. Basically, they can seal up. So even though they're exposed, like in the noonday sun, some marsh mussels and stuff, they'll seal up and they'll be fine, even though they would imagine they would be getting like really hot and desiccated. But they're okay. They've sealed up. They've got a little wet inside their shell and enough oxygen there. They can slow down their metabolism and sort of survive through that hot period. So all of the animals there are adapted to sort of how salt marshes function in the long term and what they're exposed to in the long term.
that is impressive. So then you have on top of that the physical aspects of this kind of system. Can you tell us something about that? So you mentioned they operate as a border there between land and sea and so on, but then other things, and I know that you are an expert on the gases with this
Yes,
too, right?
That's my claim to
That's your
fame.
thing,
Yep. Yeah, so the physical system is pretty dynamic, right? Because you can imagine in a salt marsh, and there's lots of different types of salt marshes, and in tropical systems you might have something like a mangrove, which sort of functions a little bit similarly. But these systems are experiencing like the ocean coming on one way, on one end. Some of them are fed through different streams and rivers that might sort of pass through them, right? So they get fresh water this way and they're getting salt water this way. And that the balance kind of the nutrients and sediment that come in from streams and rivers, and then the nutrients and sediments that are coming in from sea are very important. And you can actually have different sort of shapes of these systems depending on whether or not you're like at a river delta for a certain mangrove, for example, or maybe you're on a coast, like a lot of marshes around in New England, for example. Not all of them are like next to big streams and rivers. Some of them are. So it really just sort of varies.
Right, right. So they have a lot of variance. And then when it comes to the things like the gas exchange, because the CO2 we hear a lot about right now, so I want to ask about that
Sure.
they operate as a carbon sink, but there are other gases.
There
Okay.
are. Yes, there
Take
are.
it away.
Okay. So CO2 absolutely is the thing we hear the most about, and that's a very powerful greenhouse gas. There's also methane. So anywhere, basically, if you think about salt marshes, they're this hot spot of metabolic activity, right? They're photosynthesizing like crazy, which means they're producing a lot of food for other organisms, including microbes.
Right.
And a lot of that carbon gets stuck there, which is why they're so good at sequestering carbon or storing carbon for us. But that also means that there's like food there to fuel microorganisms. And the decomposition of that material that the plants are making produces gases. And so some of them are other powerful greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. So methane is around 25 times powerful, give or take, CO2, like molecule to molecule. And nitrous oxide is almost 300 times more powerful.
Whoa.
Yeah, molecule to molecule. And it gets complicated fast because it depends, some molecules last longer in the atmosphere and things like that. But just in general, those are sort of two key gases. And then the other one that's not a greenhouse gas is N2. So our atmosphere, you're probably familiar, our atmosphere is almost 80% N2 or dinitrogen gas. We breathe more N2, right, than oxygen.
Right.
And nitrogen in salt marshes, another sort of ecosystem service that they do is they can sequester and remove nitrogen from the environment and turn it into N2 gas. And that's good because we need nitrogen. Without life, there is no nitrogen.
That's our atmosphere,
Yep. But too much nitrogen causes a whole bunch of other problems, like eutrophication and low oxygen conditions, losses of biodiversity and things like that. So salt marshes provide this service there are a bunch of microbes that live there that do this natural process of converting usable forms of nitrogen to N2 gas, which most organisms can't use.
That is fascinating. When you see the interdependence, and not only that, then there'd be external factors like heating or overabundance of CO2 in an atmosphere. All kinds of things then weigh in on this system.
Absolutely.
And again, we're back to adaptation, how well and how quickly
they can adapt.
Even little microbes can adapt at this rate.
Right, and that's a big question, right? Because these systems are like defined by change. But at this point, we're accelerating the rate of change so much that we're not giving any of the organisms really time to adapt to that change. And that to me is the worrisome part.
That is very interesting. Just very quickly too, on top of that, it seems to be that the case that there are all these toxins invading the atmosphere, the oceans, the rivers, the everything, they're everywhere. And those might be having an impact as well. The other one is development along the coast. I don't know if that's a factor of damage.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% it is. So one of the ways that salt marshes can adapt to sea level rise, like rising sea level, right, is in the past they could migrate backwards. So they could take over a forest, for example, or a field of some sort, like a meadow, right?
Invade the land.
Invade the land. But now what we have done is we've put roads and parking lots and seawalls, right? All this development, so they run up into a hard boundary, and they cannot migrate over cement. Right. So that's a big issue. So trying to figure out how to sort of open up those pathways again, allowing them to move backwards.
Yes.
Because again, they're made for adaptation, but we have to give them the space and time to do that.
Exactly. So that development along the seacoast is damaging to these systems that are really crucial for preserving the land.
Yes, and that, I mean, that's the interesting, like, that's the
Yeah,
conundrum,
right.
right?
Hello, yes.
Like, we rely, I really, I don't want to say preach this, but I really think, like, the future of humanity, like, rests in the future of our coastal systems.
Exactly.
And so many people live along the coast.
Absolutely.
We rely on the coastal blue
Yes.
economy. What is it, $3 to $6 trillion,
Yes.
comes through the coasts globally. So, I mean, we need them. And yet our very presence there can be quite damaging.
Exactly.
But I think we can live in coexistence. It is possible to do that.
Yeah,
so-
right. But so you have multiple forms of threats, multiple threats, the toxins, the development, and then rising sea level?
Yes, and actually along the development thing too that I
Okay.
hadn't mentioned, right, is that when it's not just we put a hard barrier too, right, but we also can change the hydrology or how the water is moving through the marsh. And so marshes need to be able to, they get flooded, but they also need to drain. We don't want to let the
right.
water pool on there for too
Right.
long. And if we mess up the water flow by putting a road through a marsh, and then sometimes we try to restore it by putting a culvert. Lots of those can, sometimes
gets worse by the
Well,
minute,
sometimes,
right.
sometimes we do it correctly. I don't do this, but sometimes we do it correctly and sometimes we don't, right?
Right.
And then we even have, marshes, we have historic sort of markings on the land when we ditch them for mosquito control to try to drain the marshes faster or to allow animals to graze on there.
Yes.
And if you look like aerial photos of most marshes in New England, you can see like the beautiful, when you see curvy lines, you can think like, oh, nature did that. When you see the straight lines, like nature didn't do that.
Right,
Although
right.
humans are part of nature, and that's another important thing to remember.
Anti-nature.
Yeah, and so you can see that you can still see the scarring, even though that was done in the 16, 17, 1800s. We can still see those markings on the land.
Yes, yes, yes.
So-
And now it's probably gotten worse. I mean, as it continued to develop and spoil the waters and everything. What about rising sea level as
Yes.
well on the marshes? And as you say, they don't have any place to go. They'd go inland if they could, but
Yeah, so sea level rise, that's a...
Right.
So, I mean, since the 1880s, it's risen globally about 9 inches.
wow.
And it's accelerated over since the 1990s, it's
Yeah,
been
yeah,
accelerating.
yeah.
And here in New England, I'm thinking like since the 1950s, I think it's about 4 inches
wow.
increase of sea level
Yes.
rise. So that is a noticeable sort of marked difference of what's happening. And that is just the general sea level,
Yes,
right?
yes,
That's not
right,
talking about
right.
any flooding events
Yes.
or adding some tidal cycles in there and getting a big
Yes,
tide.
right.
So that is just kind of like the average, like the
Right.
standing sea level rise.
Right. So that alone would really change these dynamics, the physical
Absolutely.
and the biological. Is that's the case? Can they adapt if they can't move inland?
So that's something that people are talking about a lot now. We talk about this like this really sad term of a drowning marsh, right? Essentially that because it's being inundated so much with water that it cannot photosynthesize and build, because that's how marshes keep, one of the
Right.
ways they do this, right? They photosynthesize,
Yes.
they grow their biomass both above ground, their
Right.
leaves, and below ground, their roots, and that can trap particles, which helps them build sort of peat, but then all of that material at the end of the season can die and senescent and fall
Yeah,
and build
right,
up, okay?
right.
But if they can't keep that process going because they can't photosynthesize as much because there's so much water, then they're literally drowning in place.
Yes.
And so there are restoration efforts underway. So, for example, in Rhode Island, I have a student who's working with the National Estuarine Research Reserves, and her name is Nia Bartolucci. She's wonderful, and she's working with them to understand how something called thin layer placement could potentially help salt marshes. And what that is they put a thin layer of sediment on top of the marsh as a way to help the plants gain in elevation.
Ah.
So especially around here, the sediment that used to come in from rivers because we've dammed them so much, that sediment there's not enough sediment.
Yeah.
There was lower sediment anyway compared to different areas of the U.S. because of the
see.
way the glacial
Yes,
patterns
yeah,
work.
yeah.
But now that we've dammed the rivers, there's even less sediment, and so then the marshes, really the only way for them to keep pace is either to get sediment from the estuary and to grow. And so if they can't grow enough and there isn't enough sediment in the estuary, then we have to help somehow. And so one option is this idea of putting this thin layer of sediment down, which would raise the elevation of the marsh and allow them potentially to keep pace with sea level
Right.
rise. So there are active restoration, sort of experimental restoration efforts
Right,
going on
right.
right now to see if that works.
Right, but you can imagine this is a lot of work to take care of something that nature would have taken care of if we
Yes.
hadn't done
And-
some damaging things. But you mentioned the dams. It's another thing that doesn't come out. The dams have been enormously destructive to a lot of these ecosystems, and I think of marshland, the very famous ones in the Near East, what was in Iraq between the Euphrates and the Tigris that went on for 5,000 years and now is being destroyed,
Yes.
period.
Yep.
And a lot of that is due to dams, not entirely, but tell us about that if you would. What do dams do?
Well, I mean, so they stop. So, one of the natural ways that systems work is in the spring, right? That spring freshet will bring lots of water and sediment and nutrients down the river and
right.
like flood the delta or the marshes.
Right.
And so when we stop that, we get rid of that source of sediment and nutrients, which can be quite important for the productivity, right? The downstream productivity. And then, of course, dams can do things like any migrating fish, for example, right? They have a hard time getting up.
Right.
Yes.
So it's a biological material, but also, and the nutrients are part of that too. But that's very interesting that should happen. So, okay, we seem to be a force of destruction. So, but there are people trying to do something, you know. Did we cover the carbon sink issue enough here? I want to move to your projects, what you are doing specifically, but have we treated this well enough yet that this operates as a very important carbon sink?
Sure. So I think there's a couple things we could just quickly touch on. One, and I don't want to, one thing that is important is that there's a big elephant in the room. So even if we restore all of our salt marshes and our coastal systems, we have to deal with what we're doing to our planet in terms of carbon emissions and land use change, right? And so if we need to deal with that. And that is both an individual thing, but ultimately that's a large scale effort that comes from political will and countries coming together to make these changes.
It's got to be a planetary approach.
It's a planetary effort, and I say political not in terms of like politics fighting, but like political will of the people and our leaders.
And laws and that
across
sort of
the globe.
Exactly.
Yes. And so these salt marshes and other vegetated coastal ecosystems like mangroves and seagrasses are very important for sequestering carbon. And I think we need all the tools in our disposal, and they are an important tool in the toolkit to fight climate change. But they won't be the answer. They can't be the anscer.
I understand.
And so and so I say that caveat not to like shoot this project in the foot, but just to be clear that viewers need to realize that this can help, individuals can help. Voting can help. Like ultimately, we need a big force here.
Exactly.
Yep.
The other is that you just don't get a straw and pull that carbon out of the atmosphere. That it's there for a very long time in the future, no matter what we do.
Yeah, there's a lot in the pipeline.
With the sea level. I'm sorry, the seas are warming, the land is warming, this is aggravating all of this. Is that the case? Does that affect the capability of the carbon sink process?
It does. And so one of the things, for example, this project is trying to figure out, and lots of scientists are trying to do this, is to better constrain how much carbon is in, for example, a salt marsh. So, and you can think of it, it's like literally like our bank account, right? So if you think about like how much money do you have in the bank, you've got to get a handle on what's coming in and what's going out. And trying to figure that out is a big effort because we just mentioned, or we earlier mentioned how dynamic these systems are, how much is going on in them, how interdependent they are, and that's lots of variability happening both in space and time. And so to figure out our carbon budget, it's like trying to figure out your own budget, right? You've got to meticulously understand, how much carbon comes in and how much carbon goes out. And in this carbon, we've been talking about CO2, but and we mentioned earlier, things like methane and nitrous oxide add to that because of their global warming potential. So we've got to track all of that. And then when we do things like warm up the system, those microbes that are like, they're like, yes. When you ramp up the system, metabolism ramps with it, right? So they're like, I'm in a salt marsh and there's all this food around and it's warm, like this is happy place for them. but maybe not so much if they're producing, for us, if they're producing excess CO2
Right.
and methane.
And that's your project? Is that what you are working on just now?
Yeah, so this blue carbon, so it's called blue carbon, right? I don't think I
Yes,
actually
yes,
specifically just said that, but anything related to carbon sequestration in the marine environment is called blue carbon, and hotspots for that in the marine system are vegetated systems like salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And so we're trying to get a better understanding of how much carbon is in these systems, and we're really interested in that flux of material. So flux simply means like how much CO2, how many molecules are going into the marsh and coming out, and we can measure that. We're measuring CO2 right now, we're adding in methane. Nitrous oxide is like over here. It's a little bit harder, but someday we're going to get there. And I think our project sort of has two goals, right? So two big goals. So one of them is to try to better constrain how much CO2 is coming into the marsh and coming out of the marsh as literally CO2 gas molecules. There's other ways carbon gets in and out. We can talk about that if you want, or save it for another one. But so we're focused on the movement of the gas. However, there's a sort of like this other pressing thing that sort of bothers us, and that is that measuring CO2 or any of these processes is quite challenging.
I think.
And it's for so many reasons, logistically, time, expertise, all of those things, and how, right? And a lot of the instrumentation to do it is very expensive, and this gets to like a pet. I think it's more than a pet peeve, but an issue sort of in science in general.
Yeah.
And that is that the most well-funded universities and laboratory groups have the money to go do the very best science with the very best instrumentation. And then they get the best papers, and then they get more money, and you see the positive feedback loop.
Another elite.
So it's like technology as a gatekeeper.
Exactly.
They should have, I'm not saying those groups, mine included, shouldn't have them.
Exactly.
Except
we'd do a better job if this were
right. We cannot use
distributed.
Yes, we can't use technology as a gatekeeper, right? So we have this sort of passion to try to understand how can we get sensors into the hands of more people? Because if we could, on the one, just selfishly for like wanting to understand a system, right? We would have more data to understand these very important systems, so we could build models to forecast how to take care of them. We would figure out how to better restore and manage them, so all those are good.
But you need that data.
But we need those data. And then on the other hand, like, who am I to be the only one asking these questions? Not I, right? But the sense that like we need to broaden the pool of who can ask questions, because all the diverse perspectives that are out there.
That's right.
So it would be amazing if we could say, and not just in the U.S., right? We have like long-term dreams of being able to give it to certain like different nations that are restoring mangroves or salt marshes, and being like, awesome, here's your sensor package so you can measure these fluxes and get these data back. And I think those things are possible, but it could be, college students from non-R1 universities or community colleges where they're not focused on research, but they have an interest in it. Absolutely.
And it's an education at the
100%.
same time.
Yes.
At the same time. You mentioned the sensors. I know that you have little thingies to carry around.
I know. I didn't bring one. I failed to bring them. I know. You can go to coastalocean.org and see them.
You can send us an image if you will, and I'll put it into the video. But that they go around with these sensors. It seems like this is a very important thing to get this data. And I'm not sure that we in the public have been very well informed about it. This is no small trick. It's very laborious, and then you've got to build models, and we're running out of time with this.
Don't get dark. Don't get dark on me.
Exactly. No, I mean that in terms of dealing with the crisis, understanding these systems to begin with is one thing, and then dealing with the crisis at hand. Where we don't have enough time to fool around. They've got to fund and take care of these things.
We do.
And citizens can help, or students, or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So I think, right now the technology is, expensive. It's hard to move around, takes a lot of expertise. Our goal here is to build something that's from off-the-shelf components, that's low cost, and then we could, the dream ultimately would be like really like a share economy type of model,
yes,
right?
right,
So,
right.
Instead of renting your bicycle or your apartment for the weekend on the
Right,
beach,
right.
you can go online and be like, I would like 3 of these sensors and their little chamber. They come in for 3 months or 6 months, and we would send them to you, and
Yes.
you could use those. And the deal is, if you use them, then the data is automatically free.
Yes.
We would, quality
But you
assurance,
have to-
QA/QC it,
yes.
beam it up to the database,
Right.
and there it is. That's the dream.
Right. Sort of like just a big international enterprise, the shared data and the whole 9 yards. It's really the only way to go.
I think it is. Yes.
Basically. But then you are, in our last couple of minutes, you're doing this project. Whereabouts is it? And how can people participate?
Sure.
And does it work well?
Well, I hope so. So right now this is a nationally science-funded, NSF-funded project, and it's coming to a close. So we are looking for new funding.
Here's your begging
So
cup.
here it is. Here's my address. So we right now have about 8 sensors that are ready to go to
And
be
these
shared.
are little things.
And they are in a package like this big,
Yeah.
and you need a chamber for them, because basically what you do is you put your sensor inside of a chamber, which is it's just an acrylic tube essentially that is sealed and gas tight. And then the sensor will sit here, and you can close it up for about 10 minutes, and it will measure the change in concentration of CO2 over time. And then you just pick it up, and as long as we know when you put it down and when you opened it, that's all we need to know.
You don't have to make a lot of errors. That's one of the problems sometimes with citizen science. But you're saying
all science,
no.
actually. Yes.
Well, everybody.
Everybody.
We share that.
Yes.
But the thing is that people could do this. They could participate, and it will be accurate, and you could be learning this all over the world.
That's the
And
dream.
Then everybody would be contributing to saving the planet a wee bit there.
That's the dream.
I wish we could go on with
Me
this.
too.
This is really interesting. We will have to continue this at another time
Okay.
if you do not mind.
not at
but
all.
Dr. Fulweiler, I thank you so much for this fabulous information, and I hope people are inspired to get in touch and get out there in the marsh.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay.